Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So in today's episode of things the religious leaders are going to die mad about, Jesus eating. Okay, so not quite. It's probably a good idea to be reminded that eating in this context doesn't just mean catching a quick bite at the local coffee shop, exchanging pleasantries, and moving on. It actually refers to sharing deep table fellowship with someone. It's where the food could be good, but the people around the table are what elevate the experience to something more than just having dinner. Eating with someone is a mark of camaraderie and acceptance and friendship. By eating with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus is demonstrating a profound and abiding acceptance of those society has deemed beyond the moral pale. A deep welcome, a rich hospitality. And they're mad that Jesus is offering this gift of hospitality to sinners. Again, a wee reminder that this isn't some sweeping theological statement like Romans chapter 3, verse 23, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No. When Luke describes someone as a sinner, he's talking about someone whose pattern of sinning is so habitual, even second nature, that the whole community knows about it. It's deviant labeling. By sharing table fellowship with them, Jesus is welcoming the local untouchables and the ne'er-do-wells, the moral degenerates and public outcasts. He is welcoming, accepting, and befriending to the point of embarrassment. And the decent folk are, quite understandably, concerned. So Jesus, in that clever way he does so well, decides to tell some parables. And one final reminder before we really launch in, parables cannot be solved, okay? They're gifts. They're meant to be experienced. They are not a Rubik's Cube that you solve and put on the shelf like a trophy. You get a big clue about this every time Monica shares a parable with us. Pay attention, because she starts by talking about the kind of container the story pieces are in. They aren't in an open-faced basket like the other stories. No, parables are tucked inside boxes, gold boxes, like special gifts meant to be unwrapped and experienced. Jesus loved teaching through parables. So in response to the Pharisees chiding him, Jesus tells 3 parables. 3 parables about lost things: a lost sheep, a lost coin, and a lost son. Each parable describes the exuberant joy when the lost thing is found. This morning we're only going to touch on the 3rd of the parables in Luke, the prodigal. So there's a man who had 2 sons. The younger son asks his father for his share of what would eventually be his inheritance. This is scandalous. Even if ancient law, Jewish or Roman, had provision for doing what the son wants his father to do, which is most unlikely from what we know based on the sources we have, it is an affront to the father. In the ancient world, as today, an inheritance is received only at the death of a parent. So the son's request amounts to saying, "Dad, frankly, I'd rather have your money than you." Rough. In verse 13, it says of the younger son that he gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. So pause and think about that for a minute. I mean, I loved that in the parable story, he has like these bags of gold that he carries with him. But his inheritance would have been a portion of the family's land and livestock and staff. But you can't travel with all of that in your carry-on luggage, can you? So the point Jesus is making is that after getting his inheritance, he liquefied his assets. He sold all that his dad had given him, land that had likely been in the family for generations, and he pocketed the money that he gathered from the quick sales and went off to a distant country, all while his dad was very much still alive. This is a person who had no intentions of coming back to the family home. He severed every possible tie and distanced himself physically and emotionally. Is almost criminal. So the story goes that the son squanders his inheritance, which is where we get the notion of him being a prodigal. The word prodigal means to be wastefully extravagant. Of course, Jesus never calls the son that, does he? We gave him that title somewhere around the 5th century, so it's stuck around. And the title's not wrong, really. He did live wastefully and extravagantly, so much so that he ends up alone and serving as an indentured servant to some local Gentile, feeding the pigs, and wishing he could share in their slop. Pretty much the bottom of the barrel at this point. Rough, considering where he started. But he deserves it, right? He deserves what he got after shaming his father and his family in this way. He isn't any better than those pigs. So when he shuffles shamefully back to the family estate, tail between his legs, looking for a job, we are gobsmacked still, 2,000 years later, we are still shocked that the father runs to him. Of course, lots of sermons have been written about this action sequence. It may not seem like much to us, but a man who ran like this in Jesus' time would have been bringing shame on himself. It was well below his station. I can't overstate how debasing it would have been for the father to run. The patriarch of the household, robes pulled up, exposing his ankles and calves so that he could move faster towards his wayward son, leaving behind his dignity, his honor, and his right to exact punishment. Seeing his father moving towards him, the son starts spitting out, reciting the speech that he had prepared. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Please just treat me like one of your hired hands. But before he even gets a chance to finish, his father throws his arms around him and welcomes him in. Those like ugly, happy tears, like an Oprah cry of sorts. And the father places the best robe and a ring on him. And then, Daddy throws a big party. So tell me who the prodigal really is. Because I'd like to go on record saying that it's the dad. Because listen, if him running to his son after all the son had done to the family and their reputation and their relationship wasn't proof enough, and if him throwing a massive party wasn't also proof enough that the father's welcome and grace are extravagant, even wasteful or over the top, then what ought to really convince us is this next scene, where once again the father lowers himself to leave the party that he is hosting in order to go and look and find his older son, sulking out in the fields. The bitter elder son who had always towed the line, always worked hard on the family land, was loyal, rule-abiding, and steadfast. He was outside grumbling because of the big party being thrown in his brother's honor. The host of this party does the unthinkable. He leaves his guests. He even leaves his younger son, and he goes to seek out his firstborn. Elder brother is mad. And I think we get it, right? We can sympathize a little bit. I know I can. Listen, he says to his father, for all these years, I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. You've never even given me a young goat, so I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, this son of yours who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. He's not wrong. The older brother is bitter. Listen to the father's response. He says, son, you, my son, you are always with me. And all that is mine is yours. We had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and he's been found. So did you catch it? Did you catch the turn of phrase? The elder brother, in addressing his father, uses the term, this son of yours. This son of yours. But then the father addresses him as my son. My son. And then he says, this brother of yours. This son of yours is turned into this brother of yours. He was lost, but now he's found. The father is committed to them being reconciled. He wants them to be brothers again. Every single time, the father will run towards, will move towards, will be the prime mover, and he will give up dignity in order to get closer to each of his sons. What he wants them to see is each other as brothers again, not enemies or strangers. This brother of yours. Now, like last week's parable of the barren fig tree, this story is left open and unfinished. Did the fig tree ever grow figs? We don't know. And today, we could ask, were the two brothers ever reconciled? We don't know. In the video we played last week, the narrator suggested that if we can't read the end of the story, then we must write it with our own lives. We know what it feels like to be one of the sons, to be the wayward child or the dependable child, to be the begrudging sibling or the sibling who feels like they can never measure up or get it right. We know what that feels like. And so when we enter into this parable, we can get pretty frustrated when we look at the father's character, frankly. When we see the way he runs towards the younger son to offer prodigal grace. And then he leaves his own party to go looking for his older, bitter son to offer prodigal grace. The reason that we get frustrated, church, is because this smacks so hard into our concept of fairness. It's not fair that the younger son be welcomed in and celebrated. He should have had to earn his way back into favor. And it's not fair that the older brother is expected to come to the party for someone who took off and lived lavishly while he stayed home and worked hard and followed the rules. Our problem with this story, if we are honest with ourselves, is that we think that God is fair, not gracious. And we know this because of that time-honored and much beloved hymn we sing often at funerals, Amazing Fairness. I'll give you a minute. But God isn't fair. God is gracious, lavishly so. I mean, technically, it is fair that it is the Father's grace to give as he wishes, but it doesn't line up with how we understand what is right and wrong and fair. If we are honest with ourselves, it might be true that when we are the ones in need of grace, we want it to be amazing. But when it's someone else in need of grace, we want it to be exclusive or fair. Oh, you're lively now. We catch a break, but we perceive others as skirting the system. As much as we may not like it, the bottom line is that fairness is not a biblical concept. It isn't. Justice, love, and grace, those are biblical concepts. And that's ultimately what these parables are about grace that is amazing, exactly because it goes outside and beyond what we understand to be fair and right. And when we, like the older brother, get grouchy because we don't like witnessing such prodigal, lavish grace, that's when we get in hot water. When we feel like we know what the boundaries of God's grace are, that's when we for sure have missed the point. And if you can stretch your mind back now to how our reading began today, that's how it started. The Pharisees and legal people were grumbling because they felt that Jesus was playing outside of the lines. His boundaries were off. He was eating with the wrong people. The boundaries are the law, and Jesus was out of line and needed to be corrected. But Jesus took boundaries and he obliterated them. Boundaries that we create to determine what is fair and who is worthy. Through these parables, Jesus, the purveyor of prodigal grace, thank you very much, invites us to reflect on how extravagant, lavish, and frankly illogical God's grace really is. This parable is disruptive in that it highlights how expansive grace can be. Grace isn't earned. It's not handed out based on what is fair. The father throws everything aside and foolishly runs to his lost son, but also in the middle of the party in which he was the host, he foolishly leaves to seek out his other son. So this is what Jesus is saying to those who are grumbling at him. Pay attention, because I'm not only coming to tax collectors and sinners. If that was the case, I wouldn't constantly be hanging out with you lot, which I do. And I'm not only eating with tax collectors and sinners, because if that was the case, I wouldn't constantly be having dinner with you lot, which I also do. Grace isn't fair. Fair isn't a biblical concept, which is really, really, really hard for us to get our heads around. I know. It's almost like it takes a whole lifetime to learn and to practice and to wrestle with it. How amazing is that? In an excerpt from her book, Saving Grace, author Kirsten Powers writes, "Perhaps the greatest surprise about grace is that while our practice of it benefits other people in our communities, the greatest beneficiary of it will be us. Grace is first and foremost a matter of the heart. It's an orientation toward the world and other people. Listen. It's an orientation towards the world and other people that keeps us from going down the road of judgment and labeling, which in the end harms us more than anyone else." That's a tough pill to swallow, especially in the world right now, with everything and everyone being so polarized. In the end, The father just wants to embrace both of his kids. And he wants to see them reconciled to each other. This brother of yours, this sister of yours was lost but now is found. And you've been kind of lost out here too, sulking in the fields because the world isn't fair. I know, beloved, I know. But there's a party inside. Won't you come in? Church, we aren't always going to agree with people's choices, and we aren't always going to be warm to the idea of extending one another grace. We're human. But we are invited to tap into God's grace, even just a little bit. It takes practice because God's grace is scandalous and unnatural for us. It's extravagant. One might even call it prodigal. And so to our prodigal God be all the glory. Amen.